to my presentation. This is focused on India, and specifically on the impact of the COVID crisis on the labor market. There's always a little bit of a delay in the response of the presentation, but hopefully you should get to the first slide. Okay, so the main focus that we have in this paper, as I said, is on the impact of the labor market. Let me see if I can do something here, but I already clicked quite a few times. Here we go. So it's just a bit slow apparently. Okay, so let me start with some of the motivation. The focus that we have is on the unequal impact of the pandemic, and specifically on the informal workers. And there is a growing concern about this category. It's a large category, especially in developing countries, and there are various reasons why to justify this concern. First of all, already in normal time, they don't have access to social protection, but in crisis time, it may be also more difficult to reach them with relief measures, because the fact that they are informal, unregistered, you don't know where they are, who they are, etc. There's quite a bit of evidence in Latin America about that from this article. Another reason why we are concerned about them is that they tend to have less access to credit and potentially lower saving. Therefore, they can not very easily smooth their consumption in crisis time. And finally, a concern is that because of these limitations, there can be scarred and have long-term, the short-term losses transform themselves into long-term losses. There is actually mounting evidence, especially in high-income countries, that the COVID pandemic has had an unequal impact on the labor market, on workers. And you have here a few examples of the literature that shows that less educated, lower wage workers have paid a higher price. There's quite a bit of evidence on the gender issue, that women, not only in the way down, they lost jobs more intensely than men, but also on the way back up, they get higher at a lower rate than men. Similarly, migrants, excuse me, and contingent workers. So there is quite a bit of evidence that the impact is uneven. There is now some evidence also for India, but mainly urban India, whereas our contribution is to show data for the whole of India. So the three key questions that we have is, first of all, can we assess if there has been indeed a differential impact between formal and informal workers? Second, what are the mechanisms that are behind this unequal finding, unequal impact? Is it because the informal workers are concentrated in sectors, in industry, in locations where the shock is also more intensive? Or there is something more inherent to being informal that weakens their protection against the crisis. And the final third question is, what happens to consumption smoothing? In fact, during the crisis, what are the possibilities? Is there a differential there between the two types of workers, which is important in the end for welfare implications. So the answer that we have, the main findings, and basically I could be done with these 3 slides. If you have absorbed all of this, is good enough for me. But the answers are these to the three questions. First, yes, there is a difference between formal and informal, and informal are more adversely affected. The mechanism is we find that there is an impact beyond the fact that the concentration of the crisis and the concentration of informal workers are overlapping. So it's not enough to control for occupation, industry, and location, but there is something inherent to being informal, and that is one hint is this lower level of protection of employment that they have, or there is a lot of literature there on the dualistic market and the fact that the formal workers are granted more protection. Finally, we find a kind of a puzzle where the smoothing is of consumption, or the reduction of consumption given a large reduction of income is lower for informal workers than for formal workers. And we have some hypotheses to explain that, one of which is that this is a special crisis whereby, in fact, better off formal workers are forced to not spend for certain type of goods, and so there is a forced savings. So indeed, their income goes down, their consumption goes down, but a little bit more than informal workers that consume less of goods that are not consumable during the crisis, such as restaurant or other retail services. There are other reasons, and I hope I can, two other hypotheses I hope I can share with you if I get to the end of my presentation. Okay, so so these are the three questions, the three answers. Let me go through the details of the presentation. I start off with some context. Here you have a graph that shows you the impact on poverty at the global level. So I start from the global level. There are two scenarios that were calculated for the impact of global poverty of COVID. The one is a baseline scenario where the impact on growth is large, but not as large in the downside scenario. I don't have time to go to the details. But the bottom line of this is that the impact of an increase in poverty is between 88 and 115 million additional poor because of COVID. And basically, in either scenario, one of each two new poor are from South Asia. So South Asia is really losing big in these circumstances. And India is the largest, obviously the largest, most populous country in South Asia. So this should give you a little bit of an impression of how dramatic can be the impact for India in terms of poverty. The other interesting aspect of context is that the lockdown measures of India have been one of the most intensive of those that have been measured by the Oxford index that is reported here. And the period where it was at the maximum level of 100 is about between end of March and May, which is the time where we have good data to observe what happens in the labor market. But it has come down, but not dramatically so. In terms still of context, the impact on GDP, on growth, is the largest on record since GDP has been calculated in India. You have to go back 30, 40 years for a minus 3-point-something%. These are quarterly data. The 2020 contraction is about 10%, 9.6% for India. So it's a really serious contraction. And it's reflected on the increase in unemployment that you see here in both urban and rural and total. Don't be too excited about the reduction of unemployment after the peak, because the structure of employment is quite different. Even if employment is almost back, not all of it, but almost back to the pre-COVID levels, the structure of employment is different. There is much more uncertain employment than before. So a few words on the data. We are quite fortunate in India to have access to a very, very good panel data. Very few developing countries of this size have such good data. And we use the Center for the Monitoring of the India Economy, CPHS, the Consumer Pyramid Household Survey, which is a national representative survey of almost 200,000 houses. The survey is carried throughout the time, and it's consolidated every 4 months. And so there are 3 big waves every 4 months. But the data are collected every month, and actually we were able to access the monthly data, which has corrected the weights and can be representative, almost as representative as the 4 months wave. There were some issues of collecting the data, but we have talked to the survey, the people that carry out the survey, and they have a control for the non-response during COVID. So the data is as good as it gets. I will take quite a bit of time to describe how you define a formal versus an informal workers. So I just skip all the discussion, which is a big discussion in the literature. I can talk about this more maybe in the question and answer. But we have 3 categories: formal workers, informal workers, which are daily wage, casual worker, temporarily salaried workers, and then a 3rd category, which is self-employed workers that we distinguish in the survey. So my results will be about these 3 categories. Notice that formal workers are really a small share of total employment in the country. I'll show results about 3 things: what happens to employment in the crisis, and then what happens to income and consumption of these 3 categories, with some regression analysis, but first with some very simple descriptive labor market transition, which I start with. So this is a graph that shows you what the data that we have, and we observe this panel, as I said, every 4 months. And this is the pre-COVID, before COVID, from August 2019 to December 2019. And you have this graph shows you the flow of, we have a panel, so we can follow people, the flow from these 4 categories: formal, informal, self-employed, and unemployed, or out of the labor force, at the beginning, and where they end up at the end, or in December 2019. You see some churning. What I want you to focus especially is moving in and out of employment, which is our main variable, rather than between categories of employment. Definitely, this level of churning increases enormously during the crisis, which we have observation again between December and April, at the peak of the lockdown, as I showed you. And you can see just by eyeballing the enormous amount of churning and the flow into employment losses from all the 3 categories, but you will see in the regression analysis relatively more so from the category of informal workers. So I'll go to the actual analytical analysis with the regression. We employ a difference in difference approach, and we basically use this for all the 3 variables, outcome variables, so employment, but also for income and consumption. So you have that this outcome variable is measured at the individual level, and for the initial period T, and then what we use as regressors are the type of the category of worker, post, which is a dummy that indicates whether is pre or post COVID, and and then the difference in difference estimator, which is the interaction between the category of the worker and the post variable. And we use a series of fixed effect interacting with this post, or as I call it, a wave, but it's basically again the post. So this is a standard setup for difference in difference. We are interested in the differential impact of the COVID, or better, the lockdown, on different categories of workers. And before giving you this result, look at this table, which is the data are the same as the graph that I showed you before, but this shows of each of these three categories of 100 people that were formal, self-employed, or informal. In December, before the COVID, 79.7 were employed, were formal. Of 100 formal, 79 were employed, and at the end, 64 were employed. So from 74, they went to 64. So there is a 15 percentage point losses for the formal. The informal is twice that much the loss, so it's 36%. The loss for self-employed, it's a bit strange to talk about loss of employment for self-employed because they can't really fire themselves. They reduce maybe the amount of work, but they don't really fire themselves. But the reduction is that when they are inactive, they report that. So I want you to focus to this 36%, which, by the way, is a 21 percentage point difference from the formal. So it's a big difference. So going now for the full controlled rather than unconditional means that I showed you, here are the results. There are different columns. The different columns are, the main difference is the control, the fixed effect control that we use across. So in the first column, which I highlight there, we have no fixed effect control, and we can measure the impact on formal by just looking at the post variable. Okay, so the post shows you that 15 that I just showed you before. That is when the category, the formal category is the baseline category. So when the workers are formal, the dummy for daily wage and self-employment is 0. So the only thing that you see in column 1 is actually 15. Okay, so that's 15 for the formal. For the informal is and daily wage and temp, the informal, it will be 15 plus 21. So I'm back to that 36 that I showed you before. Okay, so that's the first. I hope you follow up to now. I know it's a lot of numbers, but look what happens when we begin to control for fixed effect, and the differential, the 21 percentage point differential goes down quite dramatically, but it remains significant even when we control for all district, industry, and occupation fixed effect. What is interesting to note is that the informality is fairly uniformly spread in the India geography, and so when you move from column 1 to 2, you almost don't, and you control for district, you almost don't lose anything. So there's no concentration of informality and shock geographically. It's spread, so there's no difference. But when you begin to control for industry and occupation, especially occupation, you begin to see that there is some coincidence of the shock and the concentration of informality across certain type of occupation. Okay. The other thing to notice is that the self-employed, as I showed you before, is also at a loss vis-a-vis formal worker, but much smaller than the loss for the actual informal wage workers. Okay, so time to conclude. Okay, so Yes. Okay. So I have let me take a few moments to show you some more results, but I'll try to be extremely brief. So I showed you now that even if you control for all of these, there is still something intrinsic to the informal worker weakness against the shock. And here I have some results that will show you that indeed is somewhat institutional and labor market regulation that favors the formal versus the informal. So there is a whole policy discussion that we can have about that, but I am avoiding it now. So then I have the same analysis for income and consumption. And what I said to you was that there is a kind of a puzzle because the losses in terms of income are still larger for the informal versus the formal, as this table shows you. But in terms of consumption, is actually the reverse. So this is the puzzle that I mentioned at the very beginning. And so these are the results, the same results, but I don't have time to go through them. So I skip them. And the results even, so the table that I quickly showed you was that unconditional means. When we do the regression, we find the same thing. And this graph summarizes that the differential impact for the informal is that they lose more than the formal, and you have the coefficient there, but they actually seem not to lose that much in terms of consumption. So why is that? What is that? And now we have, and I'm almost done there. Why we have this result? There are potentially three types of explanation that we explore. One, I mentioned already, the forced saving, and I have some evidence for that, but I will not show it to you. And the forced saving just shows that there is the formal and informal have different pattern of consumption. The informal consume much more food than non-food, and food was less restricted. Access to consumption of food was less restricted than access to non-food consumption. Therefore, the formal workers that consume more of non-food were forced not to consume. Okay, so they in fact we have evidence for that, and I would be happy to show it to you. The second potential reason is that in this food consumption, the type of food that the informal consume, the price has gone up more than the prices for food items and non-food items that the non-formal, that the formal consume. So there is a differential price impact, and there were some issues with the distribution of food, which have pushed up the prices, and this has a punishing effect for those who consume a lot of food items. And so in real terms, rather than in value terms, there is no smoothing. So we would, if we were looking at a real impact, that would correct the puzzle. And the final one is that, the most interesting one is probably that the way that people correct and smooth is based on permanent income. And we have some evidence, we are still working on this, that the adjustment of the permanent income is larger for formal than informal. Informal, the life of an informal person in South Asia is a life in insecurity. So yes, this is a big crisis, but they don't adjust so much their permanent income as the formal. Having a formal job is very hard. When you lose it, it's not easy to get it again. And so your adjustment of permanent income is much larger. So for these three reasons, we can explain the puzzle. So I leave you with my three conclusions. That is the slide that you saw before, and I stop there. Thank you.